everyone. Good to see you. I am so inspired by just being here. It's a new time for me to be at the BIF conference, so I appreciate everyone being so welcoming, and I'm especially inspired by my Girl Code new Shiro. Is she still here somewhere? She was fantastic. You almost made me want to buy my own tampons going forward, so that might change. We'll see. Maybe you inspired me that much. As Saul so graciously introduced me, I do work at GE Crotonville. GE is just a phenomenal company of which I'm very proud to be a part of. And I've had several titles over my 16 years at GE, but the one that sticks with me the most is the one that my 10-year-old son gave me as I try to continuously explain what I do for a living. And every time I try to explain it, it most recently comes out as I'm a camp counselor for big people. So. That is really the story I'm going to tell you, is how I actually acquired that particular title. So how does a 123-year-old company reinvent its culture to be faster, simpler, and even better? And that's really the challenge that we're facing right now in what I think is probably the most significant cultural shift our great company has ever seen. Well, here's how we started. We reflect on our beliefs. We used to call them values, and now we've changed them to have 5 core beliefs. And for the first time in decades, they're actually aspirational, not actual, to make sure that we're constantly reinventing ourselves and learning and trying to be even better. Secondly, we evaluate performance, but now it's continuously. So many of you might have heard of a program called Session C. It's how we evaluate our performance at GE. It's an annual event. It takes months of preparation, and it truly is just that. It's an event. So once a year, every manager sits down with every employee and does the pretty traditional performance evaluation. Now, it's much like Twitter. So you can actually text your feedback to any employee, from the chairman through, again, any employee throughout our company, instantly, and instead of an event, it's just continuous. So that particular program and process and system had been around since the Jimmy Carter era. So this was a long overdue and much welcomed change for us. Speaking of long overdue changes, our compensation program, specifically our bonus program, was also due for a facelift to match what we had done in other areas. And that's where the right behaviors are being rewarded through a pretty radical new bonus program that we've put together for our senior leaders. And then lastly, and this is where I come in, it designs its leaders differently. And we've made a commitment to not design courses, but instead to design leaders by really making it personal. And that's the story that I'd love for you to hear. So my big question then was, how can I matter in this massive transformation that we were embarking upon? All hands are on deck. Everyone's contributing to what we think will make us or continue to make us a contemporary company that's relevant, that's in service, that's making tremendous impact on the world. And for me, I went back to our great founder, Thomas Edison, and said, well, I just have to figure out what's needed, and then I just have to invent it. So let me tell you a little bit about my company. Again, 123 years old. We're active in 130 countries. We have over 300,000 employees. We're about to close on the single largest business acquisition we've ever done, Alstom. And we are in the heavy industry space. We used to own NBC Studios. We used to own GE Capital. We've been in plastics. We've been in several different industries, but now we're truly focused on aircraft engines, healthcare equipment, many different power distribution units, and other alternative energies. Now let me tell you a little bit about the people I work with. As was mentioned, I work with our senior leaders, which is the top 6,000 leaders of the 300,000 that were mentioned earlier. And quite frankly, they're wicked smart. They each run about $1 billion business. It's overwhelming and daunting to understand the pressure that they're under, from my perspective. They're all type A. I think you guys get the picture. Perfectionists for sure, and quite frankly, I want a person who's designing an aircraft engine to be a perfectionist, so I'm pretty happy with that myself. We're a pretty strong engineering company. These folks think in a linear, very organized fashion, and for that reason, they like rules. Rules matter in this case for a number of really great reasons. And in are coming the millennials, which is just a fantastic option for us to really, again, not only look at our offerings, but also the way in which our culture supports those offerings. So now a little bit about me, and I think you can kind of see where the challenge comes in. I'm not necessarily wicked smart. I'm more of a scrappy bulldog. I am perhaps type A. I'd prefer to say passionate. I'm not a perfectionist, but I am an excellentist. I am nowhere near being an engineer or a financier or a marketeer or any other ear that we typically hire. I'm a liberal arts major. We don't have many of those at GE. I thrive in chaos. I leverage my imagination greatly. Not really quite sure I ever pay attention to rules, and quite frankly, I feel like I'm a millennial who was born too soon. So all of those things together have made a pretty challenging case for my ability to be effective in the role that I was hired for and wanted to thrive in. So I figured out the number one rule that must be the case for corporate innovators everywhere is give yourself permission to be fired. So starting with that, I then understood that if that was as bad as it could get, there was nowhere to go but up. So let's talk about how that started. This was my classroom. It's a pretty traditional lecture type environment. It seats about 90 people. My classes, there are several different versions, are anywhere from 2 weeks long to 4 weeks long consecutively, depending on the nature of the class. And yes, they do sit in those chairs in that room for that entire duration. They usually start at 7 and they usually end at 10 o'clock at night. 7 in the morning to 10 o'clock at night in that room. And oh, by the way, there are no windows in that room. So that's how it started, and I was told that my job would be just fine if I could sit in the back of my room, the room. I'm allowed to do email back there, and just make sure that the faculty members, who were mostly consultants, would just come in as scheduled. And I couldn't imagine a more painful job at that point. This is 5 years ago when I started at Crotonville. And believe it or not, this room has such a legacy name that we can't even change it. We've petitioned, we've asked, we've even put in new placards that were eventually found out by our chairman. The room is called The Pit. So that's the actual title on the room. It has been like that for 56 years, and it is not going to be changed anytime soon. So you kind of get the picture about the kind of work that I took on about 5 years ago. So I had some thinking to do in this case, and the thinking was I needed a new mindset myself. So to truly innovate, I needed to start personally. I needed to get much more curious about my job and how to do it much, much better. I needed to be more courageous and not necessarily worry about either asking for permission or being afraid of impacting some long legacy that probably needed to be changed anyway. And then lastly, I need to be able to make it contagious. I have a staff of 4, 3 of which are actual instructors. One of the first things I did to be courageous was I pulled all of our instruction in-house so that we weren't sitting in the back of the room, we were actually right in the thick of it. And this is what we designed because of that. My first effort was I needed to get our senior leaders much more engaged than they were. So we have a program called this Corporate Executive Council. It's Jeff Immelt, our chairman's top 40 members of his executive staff. They meet quarterly in a room that's far away from all of the other students because they like quiet. And it's very ceremonial in terms of, as you can imagine, how this particular meeting unfolds. So I decided with my team members that we would create a massive sign and make it look like, in this case, a ransom note. We posted that sign just outside the door so that when they broke and opened the door, this is the first thing that they would see. And the invite here is to actually walk to a different building, go into that particular classroom, which you saw earlier, and be able to give some leadership advice that perhaps we wouldn't get in any other time. And sure enough, we had 14 people show up. So that was the beginning of some of the disruption that we started to see at Crotonville. So I wanted to create a minimally viable product, a test case, if you will, that would help us understand a little bit more about how courage could play a better role in education. So here's how we started. We took a group of 15 unsuspecting vice presidents, and we went through a program we called Speed in the City. And much like you guys, I'm sure, our goal was to try to figure out how could we help our vice presidents be a little more, or perhaps a lot more, agile, flexible, being able to ask for help, being okay with failing, which is not a common practice at GE, as you can imagine, for all the right reasons in some cases, but we're finding that we're needing to flex that muscle a lot more, and to be able to count on their colleagues much more than perhaps they do today. So we brought them to the city, and we started with a series of events, none of which were classroom-based, none of which looked like the room you saw before, and we brought them to an off-Broadway stage. They sat down. This is not at all their typical GE program. And I invited some friends. You guys might know these guys from Whose Line Is It? I think. And Colin and Brad are two comedians who not only are phenomenal improvists, but they're actually extraordinary business people. And they can explain the business of improv like no one else I've ever met. So this was a splurge for me to kind of test this out to see if this might work. So Colin and Brad were phenomenal coaches as well. They taught improv, they explained how it worked, they told them the behind-the-scenes rites of passage, if you will, for leaders of this nature. And they really help people practice this skill of don't worry about what you look like, don't worry about self-preservation, focus on your colleague, work off of each other, et cetera, et cetera. Well, at the end of those couple hours, everybody thought this was a wonderful team builder, and we're pretty excited to move on to the next thing, if you will, on the agenda. And oh, by the way, we stopped giving out agendas. So for them, this was uncomfortable for a number of different reasons. What they didn't realize, though, is that I had set up a stage in Times Square for them. And their goal was for the next 30 minutes to perform improv in front of whoever showed up in Times Square to watch them and eventually comment on their performance. So they got a total of 10 minutes notice, got souped up with those Janet Jackson microphones, and proceeded to totally humiliate themselves in front of hundreds of people. They actually did quite well, I must say. They were phenomenal good sports. They tried extraordinarily hard, and quite frankly, they had a lot of fun. And for them, in the kind of jobs that they have, this was a bit unusual. In addition to that, we started to iterate then. What else can we do to make these programs different, get them out of that classroom and give them a different kind of look? In this case, we wanted to make it personal. We put in much more reflection time. I can't imagine a human being able to withstand education from a 7 a.m. to a 10 p.m. with very minimal breaks and a whole lot of content to absorb. So everyone gets individual notes from whoever the curator of that class is. We get outside time, we get reflection time, and I travel with an executive coach wherever I go now, and everyone gets at least an hour with that person to talk through whatever it is they want to talk through. In addition, we found that it was much more critical to help them understand what being in service to another was. GE is an extraordinarily generous company, not only with its time, but also its money. But we oftentimes do that as an official kind of thing on behalf of the entire company, not something that's as small as a cohort like this. So we created a site just for the educational arm of GE called gegives.com. We've raised almost $500,000 to date just with the folks who go on these experiences, and we've traveled all over the world trying to implement improvements wherever we can. We found that giving to others wasn't the only way, though, to really show our support. Well, I needed them to practice on each other a lot more. So now, when we have meals, it's family style. It's usually pasta, something big and messy and loud and ugly, and you're forced to talk to each other and bump into each other and so forth. And, oh, by the way, they serve each other as well. So you'll see the vice president of HR right in the middle there, Susan, pouring water for everyone, and then folks on either side there making sure that their part of the experience is done. Everyone has chores. They set up, they clean up, and they participate in whatever way they can. It creates a totally different climate, not only within that cohort, but beyond. In addition, I needed to look at the space. I couldn't go back to the pit and at least be there for as long as we were. So I started to find other space. I used New York City quite a bit, actually. And now what we're doing from a New York City perspective is I'm bringing one class that has 80 participants into Manhattan. I spread them out in several hotels all over the city, and they get a text from me at 7 o'clock on Monday morning that says, you received a baseball hat on your bed when you arrived last night. You have 2 hours to find 9 other people in the city of Manhattan who have that same baseball hat. And their job is for the next 2 hours to try to figure out how to find 9 other people with that particular baseball hat. And then they get another text from me that tells them where to find me, and then we come together and we talk about that. And what it teaches them is how to ask for help, how to not be embarrassed, how to plow through something that might be too ambiguous for them, how to have fun, how to make decisions on what if you're a green hat and you see a red hat. Do you partner with the red hat or you just stick to your own green hat? Amazing the kinds of decisions that people have to make as they're going through a learning program. In addition, we started to create a space like this. We call them living rooms, where people really come for dialogue. We've ditched the pitch. We've really started to look at things much, much differently. Okay. In addition, I recently, just about a year ago, hired a director of vibe. Her number one job is to create the vibe in each of our classes, and that has made a tremendous difference for us. We've now gone off-site. We take folks to Normandy and have them walk the beaches and reflect on leadership. And at the end of something called the Lafayette Bridge, which was the bloodiest battle in Normandy, they actually have the capability of sitting in a tiny little church reflecting on the bravery that it took to go forward when they knew that all odds were against them. And of course, we try to equate that back to some of the work that they're trying to do today. They have a chance to reflect, to think, to meet, to talk with folks who have extraordinary experiences, like Tom, a 94-year-old paratrooper who made his very last parachute jump last year, doing a tandem with one of our colleagues who happens to lead this program with me. In addition, lastly, we ditched the cush. So we still had a pretty cushy experience for many of these folks. So in this case, these guys are being told that they're going to spend 24 hours in the wilderness, and they are going to be asked to survive by this wilderness expert, if you will. You can see that the expressions on some of their faces. I want you to pay attention to this guy, though. He's just about to wet his pants as he tries to absorb exactly what's about to happen to him. Okay. So they're asked to create a domain, make a fire, work with their food source, and then, of course, cook that food. Many were excited about being extraordinarily progressive about it and championing the cause, and some just could not quite take the experience as a whole. Okay. And then lastly, Africa. When we took folks to Africa, we were sent to all of the right hotels, if you will, and all of the urban environments and office buildings and those sorts of things. And I thought, gosh, this isn't the Africa that we're necessarily trying to help in terms of distributed power and healthcare and et cetera, et cetera. So I connected with a person who took me to a cousin of an aunt, of a son, of a et cetera. And he got me connected to a village, and that's actually where my class spent some time. They slept in this village, the hut made of elephant dung and mud. We had a rigged shower, if you will. It's actually just buckets of water coming through. And as I'm texting my boss, I never thought I'd be showering 2 inches away from Vice President Rue. And they learned other things that the Maasai typically do as a service culture, including jumping for women. The highest jumper gets to have all the women in that particular village. Jim won there. And of course, service projects became a component of that. So in conclusion, what we're really working on, quite frankly, is something we don't necessarily make a part of our everyday GE presentations, but I think we're doing some epic shit at GE. And to do that, you have to have some courage, you have to have some bravery. When I finish a 2-week or a 3-week or a 4-week course, my son will oftentimes say, "Mom, aren't they smart enough yet?" Meaning, aren't you done yet? Are you done with that particular course? And now, in essence, I'll be able to turn to him and say, not quite yet, but we're getting there. So, thank you for listening.